Let me start the session by thanking you all for joining us and thanking our panel. The high number of attendees, we're up at 95, and the diverse and high calibre of the panel shows what an important and topical session this is going to be. The Scottish Government's Land Rights and Responsibility Statement sets out the vision for a strong and dynamic relationship between Scotland's land and its people. It is the first of its kind anywhere in the world. Land rights and responsibilities apply to both urban and rural Scotland and are about owning, managing and using land in a fair way that benefits everyone in Scotland. It states that the people and organisations that make decisions relating to land should recognise and act in line with their responsibilities as well as their rights. For me, I think of land rights and responsibilities as a journey. Landowners and land managers of all types, be they community owned, be they private, be they an NGO, are all on their own land rights and responsibilities journeys. And we will hear some example of these journeys in the next session at 11:30, so please do join us for that. The panelists today, or this morning, will tell us about their organisations and their members' journeys with land rights and responsibilities, including Emma, who will share more of our land rights and responsibilities journey as the Scottish Land Commission, because we've also had a journey. As communities and land users, we are all on a land rights and responsibilities journeys. And indeed, as a country as a whole, we're on a journey. And that journey is expecting a real culture change. And of course, all these different land rights and responsibilities journeys are diverse, they have different experiences and they have different outcomes. And that's why we've come together today to learn more about it and share those diverse experiences. In fact, the land rights, responsibilities and statement itself is on a journey. It isn't a fixed statement with fixed principles that are set in stone. It will change over time and over the generations. And the Scottish ministers are required to review the statement every 5 years. And their first review is due by September 2022, and the work is starting very soon. The conversation we are having today is very timely as we look to the first review. And I'm now going to ask the panelists to speak in turn for 3 to 5 minutes and share their reflections on their land rights and responsibilities journeys. And I'm going to start with Linda Gillespie. Linda is Programme Manager of the Community Ownership Support Services at DTAS. Linda's previous experience includes managing large-scale visitor centres as an advisor to a portfolio of high-growth companies and managing a range of Scottish enterprise, business gateway, business and social enterprise programmes. Over to you, Linda.
Good morning all, and I'm delighted to be at this conference. I just should say, for those of you that haven't seen my room before, this wallpaper does look better in real life. I'm kind of conscious it creates a bit of interference. So I kind of work for the Development Trusts Association Scotland. So we have 328 members, many of whom own assets, be that land or buildings. And of those members have used all the legislative routes to secure those assets, be that the community right to buy, be that through asset transfer requests or negotiated sales. My own area of responsibility is within the Community Ownership Support Service. So we are funded by the Scottish Government to support the sustainable transfer of public assets into community ownership. And we support both the public bodies and the communities in securing those assets. The legislation has been enforced since, Part 5 has been enforced since 2007. And actually, it provides a framework for communities to secure public assets. And that gives them the right to request the transfer of any public asset on the basis of ownership, management or lease, with the presumption in favour of communities. And actually, this legislative framework is reflected within the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement, so they kind of mirror each other. I think we've been kind of asked to reflect a bit on our kind of journey and our challenges and the opportunities. And I suppose just in this early stage session, I would kind of flag that there are still challenges with a kind of statutory legislative framework as well as the kind of more voluntary elements. And that's kind of round about community engagement and decision making in relation to land and land use, capturing those benefits, those wider benefits beyond capital receipts, and actually just kind of conditions of sale and negotiation. So I would kind of hope the conversation kind of teases out some of those issues later on. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Linda. That's really interesting. And I think it probably reflects a lot of what other speakers are going to share. Next, we're going to go on to Calum MacLeod. Calum is the Policy Director for Communityland Scotland and a freelance sustainable development consultant based in Glasgow. In 2010, he led post-legislative scrutiny of the Land Reform Scotland Act 2003 on behalf of the Scottish Parliament and is a former member of the Scottish Land Fund Committee. Over to you, Calum.
Thanks very much indeed, Sally. And I'm conscious of time and I don't want your wrath to be revisited upon me following your performance at the 2019 conference. So I will keep this brief. I have to say that I think Communityland Scotland's the membership organisation for community landowners, both urban and rural in Scotland. We've been involved as an organisation working with the Scottish Land Commission and indeed Scottish Land in the Estates and other partners in a pilot self-assessment project whereby we have been working with 11 of our member community trusts to actually help them to assess their own performance with regard to the principles within the land rights and responsibility statement itself. And I think that's been a very useful exercise from their perspective and certainly from our perspective as an organisation. And I think one of the key points there is that the land rights and responsibility statement, I would say, along with actually the creation of the Scottish Land Commission, is probably one of the most important outcomes from the 2016 Land Reform Act itself. But it's very clear that one size does not fit all in terms of how it's applied in practice. And so I think its real value is in terms of the different functions that it has. It has an important function in terms of setting the broad framework for land reform in Scotland, which we need to define, of course, as measures that modify or change the arrangements governing the possession and use of land in the public interest. And the public interest is a key term in that context. It's also been really important, I think, in terms of encouraging and supporting different landowners in terms of the responsibilities, and also encouraging all of us to think about our own responsibilities and our rights with regard to land itself. At the moment, rightly, it is seen as a tool for encouraging cultural and behavioural change on the part of individuals and also landowners and landholders with rights and responsibilities in that sense. So that's been really important, and certainly from the pilot work that we've done, we've seen how our members have been able to address this specific principles in practice. But I think one of the big issues as we move forward into the review process for the statement itself is the extent to which we maintain and retain the sort of soft voluntary mechanism dimension of what the land rights and responsibility statement entails for landholders at the moment, but also think about how that links in as well to placing it onto a more statutory formal footing in some respects. So in other words, how does that tie into in terms of what the land rights and responsibilities statement is intended to achieve? And for example, the proposals in the forthcoming land reform bill around a public interest test for significant land holdings, for the Scottish Land Commission's own proposals with regard to statutory reviews as well, in terms of land rights and responsibilities. So I think there are important questions and issues to address in terms of the functions of the statement itself, in terms of its macro policy framing function, but also how it encourages individual land rights holders to be clear on what their rights and responsibilities are, and also landholding organisations and landowners, be they public, private, or community indeed in that sense. So I think there's some really interesting and important aspects of how we make those different connections fit together. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Calum, and that's really interesting. And I think you've left us a few hooks there for our discussion later in the session, so thank you very much. Next, we're going to hear from Gemma Cooper. Now, Gemma is Head of Land Rights and Responsibilities at the Scottish Land Commission and is responsible for the Commission's work shaping change on the ground to ensure more people benefit from Scotland's land by supporting the practical implementation of the Scottish Government's Land Rights and Responsibility Statement. Over to you, Gemma.
Thanks, Sally. So I'm going to talk to you, as Sally says, a bit about what the Commission has been doing to further land rights and responsibilities, and also a bit about what we've learned from doing that. So we launched our Good Practice programme in 2019. It's been running for almost 2 years now, and that really aims to influence culture and practice by providing straightforward advice on the statement. We support that with a programme of work to embed the land rights and responsibilities more widely in policy and decision making. And we published eight protocols which set out clear expectations for how the statement can be put into practice by all types of landowners and land managers. And we developed those in conjunction with our Good Practice Advisory Group and other key stakeholders. Our Good Practice Advisory Group are mostly here this morning: Communityland Scotland, Development Trust Association Scotland, Scottish Property Federation, National Farmers Union Scotland, Scottish Environment Link, Scottish Government, and Scottish Land and Estates. And that stakeholder engagement has really helped us provide assurance that the protocols are achievable and they're balanced. And they've been widely shared and disseminated amongst stakeholders and landowners since we published them. To support them, we have a programme of guidance. We have a set of toolkits. We have things like FAQs to support them. We have a number of good practice case studies sharing great practice in what's happening on the ground. And we provide a programme of training one-to-one in organisations and support for landowners to help put these into practice. In fact, we've supported over 200 landowning organisations to put the protocols into practice in both rural and urban Scotland since the Good Practice programme launched. And that number increases every week. We hear from more people who are looking to implement this and to think about what it means for them. Now, that includes the full spectrum of landowners, so private, public, community, environmental NGOs, faith organisations, charities, really the full spectrum of people. So what have we learned from it? Well, primarily that the principles in the statement are all achievable, mostly with relative ease by most organisations. And in addition to that, they can bring great benefits to landowners and communities who are implementing them at all levels, both at policy and sort of on the ground direct practice level as well. The statement can help us understand what fairness looks like in practice. So how do we make decisions about land that ensure that we're being good stewards, not just of the land, but of people, of places, of communities, both now and in the future? It helps us understand that. It can also help us to understand how we make a just transition to net zero. So how do we achieve our climate targets in a way which balances public and private benefit and the needs of our existing communities and the needs of our future communities? It gives us a framework for that too. It can also help us understand how we create an economic model which builds community wealth and addresses the most important issues that we have in our communities. And those are all things that landowners are talking to us about all of the time in terms of how we actually apply the statement in practice and what it means for us, how it can help us. In very practical terms, the statement also provides assurance that land is being managed in a responsible manner, provides a definition of that in the widest sense of that word. So thinking environmentally, socially, economically, culturally. And that perhaps helps us understand also what other actions people can take to further that. So that's a helpful assurance for many landowners and managers, those who've done self-assessments that Calum mentioned, those who've had conversations with us, or those that have just by themselves had a look through protocols and the statement and thought about what that means for them. We know that landowners and managers are seeking to deliver really complex outcomes and often with really limited resources. So I think it's helpful to have that assurance, to have that framework to work through. Now, those adopting the statement and the principles within it are finding that they often build stronger relationships with communities that are in and around them. They find new opportunities to work together. They find ways of collaborating to meet their shared objectives and mutual aspirations. And that brings added benefits to the challenges that they're trying to deliver and the outcomes that they want to see. So in other words, the statement adds value to people. But we've also learned that we have a lot more to do to further land rights and responsibilities. So not all landowners are aware of it. We haven't worked with some sectors as much as we've worked with other sectors. So for example, the development urban sectors. And so we actually just have less of an understanding about how it's working in those areas. So we really need to do more to raise awareness of the statement there and build a shared understanding of what land rights and responsibilities means in those contexts. Now, whilst many landowners and managers have embraced the land rights and responsibilities and are seeing the benefits, there are others who are finding it more challenging to do. They're perhaps wary of doing it. They have concerns about the impact that it might have on their business model or on their charitable aims or so on. You know, and that's really understandable because still being tried and tested, and we're still working out what it means in all these different contexts. So we can do more to explain the benefits of land rights and responsibilities. We can do more to explore that. We can take out the mystery from it. We can share good practice. And I think it's really important to provide peer support learning opportunities as well. Sometimes we have landowners who are less interested in engaging with us as well to explore that. And we really need to understand what's happening there, why that is, and find ways to encourage engagement with those fewer outliers as well. Perhaps most importantly, and in conclusion, we really just have to shift our shared understanding of what's normal and acceptable in the ways that we manage land. And the statement helps us to do that. So we've got a finite resource in land. It's a shared resource. We all have to benefit from it. So the way in which we manage it has to deliver community benefit, public benefit, as well as private benefit. And that is as important for landowners and managers as it is for the rest of us too. And the statement can help us to do that. Thanks, Sally.
Thank you, that's great. And again, quite a few hooks for what we'll be talking about in our next section. So our next speaker is Stephen Young from Scottish Land Estates. He's from a dairy and arable farming background, and Stephen joined SLE in August 2019 from the Scottish Agricultural Organisation Society, where he worked with agricultural cooperatives throughout Scotland, as well as facilitating several monitor farms and farm benchmarking groups. Stephen is responsible for managing SLE's policy team at its Musselburgh HQ, as well as leading development of SLE's policy positions and guiding the provision of member advice, while representing members' interest. Stephen studied rural business management at Aberdeen University, followed by a master's in management from St Mary's University, Nova Scotia. So he comes with a really good experience to talk to us today. So over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Sally. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for inviting me here. It's always weird to hear your biography read out to you, and it's even stranger when you look at a screen and you see yourself looking back. It's quite a frightening prospect. For those who don't know, Scottish Land Estates are a membership organisation for land managers throughout Scotland. We cover all scales of land management, from very small to very large, all types of ownership, from private companies, NGOs and community groups. Our role is mainly rural, though there is some urban members, but it is mainly rural areas that we come from in this context. As part of our journey, in 2014, we published our Landowners Commitment, which, although is slightly different from land rights and responsibility statements, is based on similar principles of responsible land ownership, which was to be open, inclusive, enabling and responsible. So it's an area we've been looking at for some time. We've been keen to work on there as well. In terms of what we do with our members, we provide advice and guidance for our members in a number of different ways. We have a dedicated Rural Communities Policy Advisor, and we provide training and information through webinars, magazine articles, that sort of thing as well. I've only been in the role for 2 years, so I can't speak about past historical issues greatly, but members regularly contact us for advice on what to do when working with rural communities and how to do things better. So how they engage, how to provide more opportunities. Recently, quite a lot of requests about working with joint ventures and use of buildings to kind of get better use from them. Our members don't always get it right, but there is a will within our membership to move forward, and they're keen to engage as best they can. I think, as Calum mentioned, we've been part of the pilot of the Land Rights and Responsibilities self-assessment scheme, which is part of the Good Practice Advisory Group, along with Communityland Scotland and NFUS. I know there was some others as well. We completed our cohorts in early spring. I think we reported back in March on that. So I'll just go through some of the kind of things that we had from it, of kind of where we are now. So I think just to agree with Calum twice. I would say that it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. It is very much a dynamic statement, I would say, and everyone has different readings into it, and it has different connotations for different contexts. It's hard to quantify that in an assessment sometimes, because you're taking what is a vision and fairly loose terms and then trying to drill down and to quantify them. So it's quite hard to do and quite daunting, but it's an interesting process to go through. Our members did find it hard to score themselves. They don't, nobody likes giving themselves a score. It's probably a bit like seeing yourself on screen and hearing your own biography. They don't like to do that. In particular, they felt they were going to be double checked by a third party. Did they get it wrong? Have they read that situation wrong? So there was some nervousness there. I would say, looking at them, they tended to underscore themselves, and they were probably a bit shy in what they were saying. And when we talked through some of the things they were doing, they were probably doing more than they realised, and they just hadn't actually articulated it, because it's, as they saw it, it's what we do. It's not something different that they've been doing. We find a range of answers as well, and there was a lot of different factors, things like location, how remote they were, or if they were next to a village or a town, the type of use, a single use land management, whether it's dairy farming or forestry or whatever, made it a little bit harder, they felt, to engage, because there wasn't as much to talk about and many changes that were there. There was also a real range of issues around engagement with communities, how they wanted to be engaged with, who in the community do you go to, where do you start, how do you do, with, in the good old days, you'd have a town hall meeting and stick a sign up on the notice board. Now it's gone to websites, but then not many people read websites or social media. So it's just understanding what both sides want, although I shouldn't say both sides, so it's a we rather than them and us, and what everyone wants from the conversation. And we also found that smaller landowners tended to find it harder to formally engage, mainly just due to lack of resource. And there was a lot of informal engagement happening. The comment I heard quite a lot was, we drink in the pub, we shop in the shop, we are part of the community. And I would always encourage that sort of thing, mainly the drinking in the pub. Of the outcomes, I would say that there are challenges to getting this right, and there was a feeling sometimes with some of the questions that there was being critical rather than trying to make it a positive experience for everyone to get a positive outcome. What I would say is change is happening and we are moving forward, but it does take time for everyone to understand, and that's expectations from communities as well as expectations from land managers and how they, as I say, back down to how they communicate with each other and what each other are looking for. There is more work to be done in explaining and developing this. I think, as Emma said, there's some really good advice there. It's just making sure everyone's aware of it and takes it and puts it into their own context. But I would say it is working. Our members are more conscious of the needs of communities and the roles within them, and we're working with them to continue that. But I think that the word journey is probably right. And it is a dynamic situation. Everyone's moving, and some people are moving faster than others, but there's certainly lots of good examples there, and we'll keep working with our members to do
that. Thanks very much, Stephen. That's really good to hear, and it's really interesting to hear about the parallels coming from the different panelists today. Now, our final speaker, Gemma Cooper, who is head of policy team at NFUS, has sadly had some technical issues, so isn't going to be able to join us just now. So we're going to move forward now to our structured discussion. Just a reminder to the audience to pop their questions in the chat box, as we'll come to them next. And I'm just going to, I think we're all going to, the view is going to change slightly. So I'll just give a couple of seconds for that. Okay, I shall kick off with our first question. So some of you touched on this in your introductions, but I'm going to come to each of you in turn with this question, and I will do you in the order on my screen as well. So how much progress do you feel has been made on the implementation of the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement, and where do you think it is strongest? So, and I think that I think we've had quite a bit of discussion on the first point, but I think it's the second point that I'm most interested in getting the answers to. So I'll come to you first, Linda.
I think certainly in kind of my world of primarily the public sector landowners, I think there has been a lot of progress. I think there are areas where there's still challenges, but I think there's been significant progress, and I also think the kind of focus on community wealth building and public bodies as anchor organisations will have a significant role in terms of how the public sector view its estate and kind of how that can be used to the benefit of communities more broadly.
Thank you. And Stephen, so we've heard from Linda about the public, but you'll have quite a different take on that.
Yeah, I think where it's strongest, I would agree with Linda, we have had fairly significant progress. Interesting, I think, in a lot of the environmental work that's going on at the moment. I think we're seeing kind of greater community engagement. I think where probably businesses see as things being fairly economic, where they look at maybe agriculture as being an economic thing rather than environmental, then they don't see the kind of that level of engagement. So I think probably, as I say, in environmental issues and where the public are more interested to get involved and have more of an interest and more of an understanding of what's happening because they're reading and seeing it all around them. So I think that's probably helped quite a lot. I think that's probably one of the stronger areas.
Okay, Calum.
Thanks, Sally. I'm going to stop agreeing with Stephen. It's not a good look for either of us. I think it's true what both Linda and Stephen said in terms of the kind of awareness and the cultural changes happening, within different types of landowners. I think that's been really important, and we've seen how that's developed. I do think that in terms of sort of foundational importance is significant. I think if you look at the 6 principles that are included in the statement, and when we went through the template, Stephen, you may have found the same. Our members found it quite challenging to kind of say anything, frankly, too meaningful about the first principle, which is basically virtually everything, human rights and the kind of big macro issues in terms of that, and also the kind of second principle as well. But I think that has been very important in terms of these first 2 principles have been very, very important in terms of helping to make the connections at the macro sort of policy level between land reform as we defined it earlier on in terms of ownership and land use, and the connections between that and the other different policy agendas, as Linda's mentioned, community wealth building, climate emergency, just transition, post-pandemic recovery, all of that stuff basically is very important, and land rights and responsibilities run as a thread all the way through that. I think that's been very, very critical. I think there's still some challenges at government level in terms of that, and in terms of public policy, in terms of making sure we stay out of these silos and kind of make those connections. But I also think that there are still some challenges too, although we're very much on this journey that's very positive and it's moving forward in a very good way. I still think there's a disconnect in terms of the general public's kind of sense of how they can engage sometimes with land use decision making. And I'm thinking back particularly to the Scottish Government published research in November of last year on attitudes to land reform in Scotland. Now, one of the findings there was that the public might not necessarily register the term land reform, but when you explain the principles to them, they're very much in favour of it, and they want to connect. But one of the other very important findings there was that I think of the folks the people that were interviewed, and it was a representative sample in Scotland, about 13% said they had actively engaged in land use decisions, and that's urban and rural. So they want to do more. So I think there's a really important role here in terms of how the land rights and responsibility statement and the kind of policy mechanisms that flow from that can actually furnish the opportunities for people in Scotland, whether it's in rural places or in urban places, to actually engage meaningfully in land use decision making. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm going to come back to Stephen now. He's got his hand up. Oh, and then Linda.
Yeah, no, it's just a quick one. It was something that I meant to mention was actually just in the last 18 months during the pandemic, and there's obviously been a lot of access issues, but there's a lot of good engagement come from that as well. And people have had time to actually speak to each other, which has been quite interesting. And I know from our members' point of view, they've had much more interaction with people and people asking questions as to what they're doing and having the opportunity to explain why things are happening, why such a crop's been grown, or why the trees are being thinned, or whatever's happening. So that's been quite an interesting kind of experiment in time, because people had time and they had time to think about things a little bit more. Normally, in our busy lives, we kind of go on in our little silos. But I think that's been one of the very few positives to come out of the last 18 months. And I say access has been double-edged. We've had irresponsible access, but there's also been some good responsible access, and there's been some positives too. So it's having those conversations has been useful.
And kind of Sally, I was just kind of wanting to come in on Calum's point, just to kind of emphasise that's our kind of experience as well, in terms of communities wanting to be involved in decisions, particularly kind of the disposal of kind of large public sites. They don't necessarily want to own them. They don't necessarily want to own a former hospital site, but they do want to have a say in what it might be used in, or they might want a bit of it. So what they're trying to use the levers in terms of community right to buy or asset transfer or participation requests, and they're kind of, they're not the right tools for actually what they're looking to do. So no, we would absolutely agree that was our findings as well.
And I'm going to pass to Emma now just for a final word on this.
Yeah, so it's interesting that the conversation has focused quite a bit on community engagement and how well that's progressed, because I was going to say community engagement feels like one of the things that has progressed quite well, and community ownership as well. We are seeing numbers of communities owning land or assets, buildings increasing. So those two things feel like they've gone quite well. I think the thing where we're struggling a bit more is around the diversification of who owns land, and that's the second principle that Calum referred to as being more of a challenge, and something that we've, to use your word, Sally, got more of a journey to go on in regards to, because we still have a concentrated pattern of land ownership. People are still struggling to have access to land for the things that they want to do, whether that's through ownership, through community ownership, private ownership, or it's lease or partnership or other, management arrangements and so on. That feels like it's still a challenge for us. But we have seen huge progress in land rights and responsibilities, across the board, and particularly where we've got these fantastic people from our Good Practice Advisory Group taking a real leadership stance in that, in their own sectors.
Thanks. Stephen, did you want to come back?
Yeah, just a quick one. Just as Emma was saying about the second principle, I think the second part of that, with tenure, more opportunities for citizens to own, lease and have access to land, I think that has changed. I think we're seeing far more kind of joint ventures, we're seeing more kind of leasing opportunities. I think we need to think out with just purely agriculture and that as well. I'm seeing a lot of our members leasing areas of buildings within steadings and things, and new startup businesses, and the new entrant work that's been done by Scottish Government's been quite good within agriculture as well. We're still a long way to go, but things have changed there slightly. And one of the things I was going to say is we probably need new research on this, because we're still harking back to research. Good research was done 25 years ago. And there's been a lot of good work done by Communityland Scotland. That's 3 times I've agreed with Calum now, and also by the Land Commission. How do we measure how we're going and kind of see where things are? So new research would be really useful in that, on that ownership and how that concentration's changed.
And that wasn't a setup, but that is a perfect reminder that we have a session on land governance and the time for new models at 1:30 today. So, and I do promise that wasn't a setup. Stephen just very helpfully mentioned that. Okay, so I'm gonna just go forward a wee bit. So I think we've had quite a bit of conversation about success and what's worked well and the kind of positives. So now I'm going to ask you a harder question. So what are the challenges for your members in implementing the land rights and responsibility statement? And then what might help those challenges? And I'll do it in the opposite order this time. So I will start with Emma.
Thanks, Sally. This is great, because this can absolutely help shape up our good practice programme for the next couple of years. So the timing for this couldn't be better. So I think, as I sort of said before, really, the challenge for me is around how we help people understand how it applies in their context. So everybody's operating in a different environment. They come from a different history of how the land or the building's been owned and managed. They live in rural or urban areas. They are living as part of their community or not as part of their community. They have a different kind of culture that they operate in. Their understanding of what we're looking for is coming from a different starting point. So for me, it's really about us working with key stakeholder organisations, working with landowners to really understand how we make it apply for them. And Linda mentioned the community wealth building work, and I think that's one way in which we're helping public bodies understand how land rights and responsibility applies for them. Not just how it applies to them, actually, how it works for them, how it can help them find some answers to the questions that they've got. I hope that's okay.
Sorry, I'll just unmute. Thank you. And now Calum.
Thanks, Sally. In terms of the kind of challenges of implementing the statement, I think one of them, just to hark back to a point I made earlier on there, is very much around the whole relationship. And we make this point, and I'm sure Stephen and Scottish Land Estates do as well in their report. The issues of context, proportionality and applicability are really important in terms of this. And one of the things that we found as we were going through the pilot program was that there's a scoring mechanism in terms of how you self-scored yourself, and as with Scottish Land Estate members, that there was a reluctance to push yourself to the upper boundaries of the scoring mechanism, or might plunge yourself to the lower end as well. So I think there's an issue there about just what kind of evidence you're looking to draw upon in terms of performance with regard to that. So I think that's a really important point. And also, just as I said earlier on, the principles that are more specifically appropriate for yourselves as organisations within the broad frame of the statement itself. I think getting that balance right is really important. There's also issues around capacity, and so sort of scale of organisation is important as well. It's quite a time, certainly we found that it varied for our members as to how long it took them to complete the self-assessment process itself. So, some participants who were very familiar with terminology, were familiar with some of the issues, were able to kind of do that quite quickly. Others took longer and spent longer doing that. So I think there are issues there about what the requirements might be and what the benefits might be in relation to that. And I think that issue does raise important points as well about how so we may come to this, but how the process of assessments, self-assessment, and kind of using the template and using the statement is used going forward. And so I think there's a really critical import to build on the excellent support that membership organisations are providing at the moment, the Land Commission is providing as well, but to make sure there's that kind of peer-to-peer support, to make sure that there's kind of support from external sources as well where appropriate, and also to think about what will incentivize, what are the carrots and sticks basically that will actually enable those who will be participating in these processes to actually engage fully and productively and in a worthwhile, positive way, really.
And hold that thought, because one of the questions in our chat box leads on from that as well. So we definitely will come back to it, even if we don't pick it up in this part of the session. Stephen?
Yeah, I think that time for the self-assessment was interesting. To see some larger estates maybe had more resource to put into it, and as Calum said, that kind of more professional viewpoint where they hear the jargon and the words all the time, so it's easier to do. But I know, some of our members who agonised over it for days. Had family meetings for several days to discuss what they were doing, and probably tried to make it scientific when really this is an art. This is not, you can't just be that prescriptive. In terms of the principles overall, not just the self-assessment, I think one of the issues is timescales of land management, and they tend to be on very long timescales. So if you've got land that's involved in forestry or it's on agricultural leases, then things don't tend to change that quickly. They can't change that quickly. So I think that can be seen as lack of progress, when sometimes it's just that's, land management is a slow burn in that respect. In terms of community engagement and working with people, not all communities are the same. They don't all have a community council that you can go to. Sometimes a community council isn't that representative of the area. So how do you make sure you're getting through to the right people, not just the ones who've pushed themselves forward, and how you do that changes. So it's a very dynamic situation that needs to be dealt with, and again, that takes time. And probably the other thing is just around matching all of this up around the commercial reality of land management as well, and that people, if they're managing land, they've got commercial responsibilities as well, either to themselves or to others if they're managing it for them. So it's a bit of managing expectations as well, whereas being part of the decision-making process doesn't mean you get your own way all the time. So sometimes having to say to communities that we've taken that on board, we hear what you're saying and we'll work towards that, but right now, we're going to have to do something slightly different, or that sort of thing. So having how to manage the expectations on both sides is challenging, I think, within this whole context. So that's kind of a broader look at it.
Thank you. And Linda?
I've got kind of, I suppose, two kind of points round about this. And this one was just to kind of build on the comment Emma made about community wealth building. And that's that kind of calculation of the benefits delivered by kind of just the different kind of ownership and different approaches to land. I mean, obviously that's a kind of an excellent kind of policy framework anyway, but it's about kind of changing that. It's providing a different language. So currently, a lot of it's just about the capital receipt. So that kind of language about what those benefits are, calculating the social value, there's obviously it's a lot easier to do the economic value, etc. But community wealth building actually provides a different language and actually also a different approach, which actually should fundamentally support more sustainability around about community-owned assets, community-owned and kind of use of assets. So from that point of view, I just see community wealth building being much, much wider with it. And the kind of other point I kind of wanted to make about community engagement was there's a lot of focus on kind of where it's got a significant impact. And I talked about large hospital sites, but actually communities, particularly in urban areas, are finding huge change in their environments, just the cumulative effect of rationalisation of the public estate. Obviously, the private sector is kind of rationalising its offices, estates. So there's a lot of change. And actually, I suppose the question I'd be putting in is what's proportionate in terms of what could be seen as quite small decisions, but actually in the cumulative, it could be, it could be a key asset that's finally lost. So I think we're entering quite a different period roundabout in urban Scotland, roundabout the cumulative effects of a lot of change across all the sectors.
That's really interesting, and I have never heard it described like that, and the cumulative effect in that way, and that's really thought-provoking. Thank you. I'm going to ask one final question here, and I think it will actually, and then I'm going to jump into the questions. And I'm not going to ask you all to answer this, so please put your hand up if you want to jump in or just start speaking. So how do you feel the land rights responsibility statement should develop, and what support or incentives, so this is leading on to the kind of challenges that you discussed, do you think could encourage greater progress with land rights responsibilities? That can be anything you like. Stephen.
Never put your hand up when you ask the question. But I think in terms of incentives, I think some of it is just allowing it to bed in, and it's that kind of peer working, people understanding what other people are doing, seeing examples of it happening, seeing real life things there. So just kind of more of what this sort of thing Emma was talking about in terms of case studies, in terms of guidance to make it there, really take the stress out of it, I would say, because as I say, I know a lot of people who are really agonised over this, and probably more than they should have done. So take the stress out of it, just talk about what you do, and then let's have a chat about what you could do. If we put it in those terms, then everyone's pretty open to things. The thing I was going to say is jargon. We're really bad for it. All of us sitting around here, community wealth building is the latest in a long line of jargon, well-being economy. Yeah, I know what they mean and I fully understand it, but a lot of people don't. I think we need to demystify some of that and just not dumb it down at all, but just use plain language. I think that would help quite a lot, because people read things and they see acronyms, and as I say, I'm really bad for using acronyms all the time. People read that and think it just doesn't make sense, so they switch off. So it's how to keep people engaged and have a kind of two-way conversation in that respect. So just simplify things. I like things simple if possible.
Yeah, I like that. I really like that. And I'm going to come back to your point actually on the kind of self-assessment and the support element again in dealing with one of the questions. So Calum?
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I do think the jargon, and goodness knows I'm a shocking user of jargon as well. I do think that's really important, and to kind of avoid that if possible, and move to just seeing how we can connect basically folks' relationship with land in ways that makes a difference for their everyday lives. And what Linda says there about the cumulative effect of an impacts of decision making, which might seem quite modest, but does have a big impact. I think that's a really important aspect, just making that connection between quite abstract principles sometimes and the practicalities of them and how they make a difference to folks' lives. So I do think that's important. In terms of how to move things on and address some of the challenges or develop it further. One of the things that came through, certainly in terms of some appetite in in the pilot work that we did was possibility of exploring at least the possibility of maybe accreditation for good practice in terms of the principles. Now, how that would work in practice, discussed, but it's one way of doing that, I think, potentially. I do think there is just a kind of cultural dimension to this, and to keep pushing that as well. I do think that most people, most landowners probably want to do the right thing and are doing the right thing to the best of their ability. That said, there will be some of different stripes who could improve their performance. And again, if we're talking about the notion of the bigger policy picture and where land reform sits in all of this, there's definitely something, again, in terms of how we connect that up with some of the other, or the very first line of the statement says, I'll paraphrase without jargon, hopefully, it says, you know, land reform in Scotland is constantly evolving, and that's true. And there are evolving policy dimensions to that as well, and one of which is, as I've said before, a new land reform bill. There will be a public interest test in that. How does that sit in terms of the sweep of the land rights and responsibility statement? How does that sit within the sweep of the proposed statutory review mechanism that the Land Commission has put to government as a recommendation with regard to actually addressing what in many cases will be quite very marginal examples of where I would imagine where behaviour needs to be addressed in particular ways to make sure that we're actually focused on using land to meet the kind of greener, more sustainable, more inclusive kind of goals that I think we all collectively in Scotland want to achieve. Thank you.
Thanks, and I'll come very quickly to Emma.
Thanks, Sally. Yes, I agree with lots of what's been said. I was just going to say that there is the review of the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement coming up, so I can see some quite strong viewpoints coming up in the chat, and it would be great to see people respond to that review when it opens. There'll be a public consultation, and that will be looking at all sorts of things about how we can strengthen the statement and strengthen implementation in particular, and some of the things that Calum has mentioned there as well may well be covered by that consultation.
Okay, thank you very much all. I'm going to move now. We have actually covered quite a lot of what the questions are asking, but I'm going to move. I'm just going to start with Emma with a very quick question. Did any public bodies take part in the self-assessment pilot, or are they planning to?
So we had one public body took part in our internal cohort of self-assessments, and yeah, that made it clear, as did the other pilots, that we need to revise the framework that we use for the self-assessment just to make it fit better with different people's contexts. So we're intending to do more work with public bodies probably around spring next year.
Okay, thank you. So I think that shows that we're very, very much at the early stages, and I think obviously some groups that went through the self-assessment would have just done it no problem, as you say, Stephen. They possibly knew the jargon. Others needed quite a lot of hand-holding, I would understand, I would expect, because they weren't so sure of the jargon or they didn't have internal capacity. And that was kind of the stage we're at with this, and we're moving forward. So can I ask, and Calum's already touched on this a bit, but can I ask what your kind of feelings would be? So we've had a couple of questions. So one's asking about kind of third-party verification as opposed to self-assessment. And another one is mentioning about RICS. You know, we've got RICS members in the audience here. This is what they do on a day-to-day basis. This is their bag. So, you know, can those kind of insights really help to shape and form the next stage? So I'm going to throw that open. Calum's already touched on it, so maybe you want to come in first, Calum?
Yes, I think it's very important to make that distinction between self-assessment and the kind of particular dynamics around that process and a third-party assessment as well. But you know, as I say, there was a certain appetite amongst at least some of the participants in the community land owner sample to engage in that process. So I think there's certainly some scope to at least investigate how that might be taken forward. And again, that should be done in a positive fashion, I would have thought. And it's about, you know, raising the kind of bar in terms of what the possibilities are, and just demystifying again, and sometimes just actually, as was said earlier on, making organizations themselves, landowners themselves, you know, more attuned to the good practice they're already engaged in, and sharing that more widely. I think that will collectively, you know, move things along. But certainly that other dimension to the process, and having some sort of dimension of accreditation could be one that is at least worthy of exploration, I would have thought.
So I think we're quite a long way from that, but it's really interesting to see the questions in the chat are already going that way, and our conversation is going that way. And I think that shows how important it is that people do respond to the consultation when it comes out later in the year. Does anyone else want? Oh, sorry, Stephen.
Yeah, no, I think our members were really quite nervous about that, because it is such a new thing and what they're doing. And it's back to this being an art, not a science. It's very difficult to verify, what people are doing. And a lot of this is about how people feel, and that's quite tricky. The other comment is made a couple of times by some of our members was, well, who's going to verify? And this is very much about local communities. As a third party in Edinburgh or Inverness or wherever, going to then be standing in judgment over how we work with our rural community in this area, and is that not taking away the whole point of this process? So I think that there would be real concern around that. I think one of the first things probably is about, just as Calum said, the positivity of it in the first place. A lot of the questions are very much, you need to do more of this, you need to do more of that, we have to do more of that, rather than saying, well, what are you doing already and what can we do? And change that sort of, it felt sometimes like an interrogational question into, all right, let's investigate and take forward and improve, because this is all about a journey. It's not about beating people over the head saying you're not there, so that, and you must be. It's really saying, how do we all move? And people are really good can get a bit better, and some people who are maybe lagging behind a little bit can move up a bit. So it's moving everyone up the line a little bit, and the way to that is through positivity, I would say, and engaging everyone in the process.
That's great, and I think it shows how early we are in this journey, that it's going to change as time goes on. Emma.
Yeah, I think there's definitely things that we need to do in terms of making the framework more accessible and easier to follow and so on. But I do think I do think it could be seen as an opportunity, actually, for landowners to be saying, yes, absolutely, I'm meeting these standards. This is me demonstrating that I am absolutely interested in being a responsible landowner. I'm fulfilling my rights and responsibilities. So I think there's something interesting to be explored in it. I'm not sure how it would work exactly. And as you say, we're really at an early stage of thinking about that. But there are ways of perhaps doing something which says, yes, I am doing this, and then building that into the conditionality. So as in license granting or funding opportunities and so on, and seeing it as quite a positive thing.
Stephen, very quickly, and then I'm going to get one more question in.
Sorry, I just say there is a danger if, as Emma says, you're meeting the standard, then people do enough to meet the standard, whereas this is actually a very fluid situation, and what you don't want is people turning into a box ticking exercise, a bit like I did in standard grade chemistry. You do enough just to pass, but I'm not good any more than that. So I would try and steer away from that and say, well, how do we continually keep moving and keep going forward? Whereas if you make it into a pass-fail scenario, then people tend to just tick boxes.
Yeah, so we're not aiming for 51%, we're aiming for 100%.
I'm just going to impossible. I was just going to say that the other thing, you can never be perfect either. That's the other thing.
I want to ask a question. So I want to ask you, I want to finish with a really topical question about what role you see the Land Rights Responsibility Statement have in helping to tackle the climate emergency. Just a small question to finish off, and contribute to a just transition. And I'm specifically asking this based on a question in the chat about large organisations purchasing land purposely to plant trees for the right reasons to tackle climate change, but then perhaps that's having difficult local issues or causing ripples. And do we see, so that's a specific example, but I'm going to ask you more widely. And the question's in the chat. It's quite long, so I'm not going to read it all, but you can all read it. And I'm going to come to Linda first on this.
I thought you would. I would like to allocate my time to Calum to answer that more fulsomely, given the work that Communityland Scotland have done on renewables, etc.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Calum.
Thank you, Linda, I think. It's a really critical, important question, and given that we don't have much time, I'm going to be very brief on this. Basically, that first principle in the statement talks about human rights, it talks about the public interest, and the key term here is the public interest. And where we need to get a just transition in terms of getting to net zero, we really do need to think very carefully about the different elements that are acting as potential barriers in relation to that. So we need to get the balance right between the public benefits that will be taken through getting to net zero, which we all need to get to, but also the kind of community wealth dimension, and that is jargon I know that Linda mentioned earlier. So we do need to think about how the market is working. It's largely unregulated at the moment, and we also need to think in ways which the public benefits and community benefits are all kind of interlinked really in a sustainable, holistic way. And I think there are important dimensions that I know the Land Commission is interested in, and we and other stakeholders, of course, are as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for all your questions. I am really sorry we didn't get through them. My next question was going to be about young people, and I've noticed it brought in crofting, which is really close to my heart. So I'm really sorry that we didn't get to them. I do hope that the Land Rights Responsibility Statement will help us with these really tricky, gritty issues going forward. Sadly, that is the end of our time today. So I just want to say a massive thank you to the panel. You've all been excellent. It's been a really, really positive discussion, and it hasn't been too jargon filled, which I think is great. It's been really great to hear the conversation. We are at the beginning of a journey, and the conversation today shows how far we've got to go. I see some comments in the chat as well about, can we speed this up? Please do respond to the consultation when it comes out later in the year. Please do join us for future sessions this afternoon. So we have our next session all about land rights and responsibilities at 11:30, and then we have our land governance one at 1:30, and then we have one about the vacant and investment programme at 3:30. So please do join us. I'll certainly be in the next session, and I'll have more time in the chat. So if some of you are there, maybe we can get on to discussing some of these bits we didn't get to. Please do fill out the survey when it comes. It's really important for us to get feedback, and just thank you very much to the panel, and more importantly, thank you to all of you for coming and listening. I hope you've enjoyed the session, and have a great day. Thank you very much.